On the morning of Thursday, November 16th, police in Peachtree City, Georgia, just outside Atlanta, received a visit from a man named John Dunbar. Dunbar said that his former girlfriend, Halima Jones, had been out shopping the night before with her friend, Ruby Joyner. The women had failed to return, and Dunbar was growing worried. As police began searching for the missing women, they quickly discovered that Ruby Joyner's husband, Louis Joyner, was also nowhere to be found. Then the next afternoon, investigators received a call from Joyner. He was in New York City. Joyner told police that he had flown there earlier that day.
He said the reason he left the city of Atlanta was to go to New York to get a driver's license because he said he'd lost his wallet.
His behavior did not equate to somebody whose loved one was missing. His reluctance to come in and meet with investigators, his reluctance to cooperate with the investigation.
Over the next 48 hours, the search for Ruby and Halima spread across the Atlanta area. Police and volunteers combed through fields and even a nearby lake, looking for any sign of the women or the van they had been driving. The sudden disappearance of the two women became a leading story in the local news.
News Talk 750 WSB.
1 year old.
Richard Sangster covered the case for WSB Radio.
DUI.
We kept asking the Atlanta police what happened to these women, where did they go? And granted, they were probably as puzzled as we were.
We have not received any information in reference to the van or where they may be. And again, I find that very unusual.
As the search continued, police kept in touch with Joyner by phone and, with his permission, taped their conversations.
The last time you physically saw your wife was when? Wednesday morning. She was on her way to work.
The discussions with Joyner failed to produce any leads. Then, on the night of November 21st, 6 days after the women were last seen, investigators got a break. Halima Jones' van was found in a remote parking lot at Atlanta's Hartsfield Airport. Inside the van were the bodies of Ruby Joyner and Halima Jones.
The back seat to the vehicle had been removed. There was a blanket obviously covering up two bodies. And in fact, you could see a foot from one of the women, I believe Ruby Joyner's foot, protruding from beneath the blanket. It was very grim.
Halima Jones had sustained a single gunshot wound to the head. Ruby Joyner had been severely beaten and strangled. Investigators noticed that there was little blood inside the van and dried vegetation was matted on Ruby's clothing.
There's no doubt that they had been placed there, that was not where the actual murder had occurred.
Authorities now had a double homicide on their hands and turned their attention back to Louis Joyner.
Louis Joyner is the prime suspect, and frankly, his behavior is so suspicious that we took warrants on him and transmitted those warrants to New York so that we could begin to search and locate him and arrest him for the two murders.
As the hunt for Joyner got underway, investigators in Atlanta still needed to find the crime scene. Their search would bring them to an abandoned neighborhood.
It's really a very eerie, kind of Twilight Zone area.
Here, authorities would discover a bounty of evidence and a roadmap to a double murder. On November 21st, 1995, Atlanta police discovered the bodies of Ruby Joyner and Halima Jones in a van parked at Hartsfield Airport. Investigators immediately faced two challenges. First, to find the crime scene, since the murders had not taken place inside the van. And second, to locate their prime suspect, Ruby's husband, Louis Joyner. Police knew that Joyner had flown to his hometown of New York City, despite the fact that his wife and her friend were missing.
His explanation for traveling to New York, New Jersey area was to get his driver's license that he said he had lost here. It doesn't take Sherlock Holmes to figure out that if your wife is missing, I don't believe your missing driver's license would be quite as important as your missing wife.
The same day the bodies were found, Atlanta detectives questioned a friend of Joyner's named Jeff Lester. Lester told investigators that he had just seen Joyner in Newark, New Jersey, but claimed they had not discussed the missing women. Police doubted his story, and for 2 days, they pressed Lester for more information. Lester finally told detectives that while he was in Newark, Joyner made a startling admission.
Jeff Lester explained to us that Louis Joyner had told him that he had to kill Ruby in self-defense, and that it had occurred in an area near the airport, and that Jeff Lester needed to clean up the crime scene for him.
Lester said that he had tried to go to the location near Atlanta's Hartsfield Airport, but couldn't find it. He also claimed that he had no idea where Louis Joyner was. On November 24th, Chambers and Beatty went to the area Lester had told them about. What they discovered there was a murder scene littered with evidence.
We're just west of the airport, and the night we found the crime scene, it was about this dark. The area is an area that the airport had condemned for noise, like a neighborhood that had been here, and all of a sudden everybody just left.
We found Ruby Joyner's sweater in the middle of the street.
But once we found that sweater on the street, it was pretty obvious that we were in the right area. Just take a very little looking around, and we started finding shell casings.
There was live rounds leading up the street from her sweater. It appeared that struggle had gone into the woods.
And we actually had to hack our way into the woods to find the crime scene.
We find an earring, Ruby Joyner's watch.
We found eyeglasses. It appeared that belonged to Louis Joyner. Shoes that belonged to Ruby Joyner.
You could literally see the scuff marks in the ground where they had fought.
I mean, there was a coagulated and dried pool of blood where obviously her head had lay while he was assaulting her.
The officers also found a spring that had come from the magazine of an automatic handgun. Police traced the eyeglasses to Louis Joyner and could now physically link him to the murder scene. Other pieces of evidence matched what had been found in the van and helped investigators determine what they believe happened.
When we opened up the van at the airport, Ruby Joyner has a lot of vegetation and whatnot matted to her clothing, and Halima Jones doesn't.
Suggests to me that Halima Jones is in fact killed first, and then Ruby Joyner perhaps flees from the scene, pursued by Louis Joyner, who is firing the pistol as he goes. The pistol is malfunctioning, so he's having to eject a round every once in a while. He finally catches up to Ruby Joyner, drags her into the woods, drags her down. She comes out of her jacket, but by this time he has control of her. He basically beats her down and strangles her until she's dead.
Authorities now had a case they could present to prosecutors. What they didn't have was Louis Joyner. On November 28th, Beatty and Chambers flew to New York City to help in the search for Joyner.
Well, we're going to bring him back.
When they arrived, they coordinated their efforts with local authorities. Initially, investigators were able to track Joyner through phone records, but he was always one step ahead. After 2 days of searching, the trail was getting cold. Detectives were looking for new leads when they received a call from the 32nd Precinct in Harlem. Earlier that evening, New York Housing Authority police officer Anthony Garretta and two fellow officers had been on vertical patrol of a high-rise apartment building. On the rooftop, 21 stories up, they came upon a man drinking rum and coke.
When we finally stopped to question him, what is he doing there, that he has no reason to be there, all hell just broke loose. He just started going absolutely out of his mind, nuts, out of his mind, kicking his feet, throwing his hands.
Garretta got one handcuff on the man as the violent struggle worked its way perilously close to the edge of the roof.
He was fighting and he tried to jump off the roof. And he tried to throw us, myself, and my two other partners off the roof at the time. Then he said, you know what, it's about time we call for help. Let's call for help. He took 3 of us, plus the 20 guys that came up there to the roofs to take this one guy down. That's how strong he was.
New York police took the suspect to the 32nd Precinct and booked him for trespassing, resisting arrest, and possession of cocaine. The man was Louis Joyner, but New York authorities didn't know there was a warrant out for his arrest. It wasn't until Joyner's New York attorney called the station that they learned who they had behind bars.
A detective from the 32nd Squad came down and says, your man's wanted for a double. I said, double what? I said. He goes, double homicide back in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm like, oh my God, I said. That's why he was fighting us the way he fought us on the roof. Nobody who's just gonna get charged with a misdemeanor is gonna act the way he acted on the roof like that.
On November 29, 1995, Louis Joyner was arrested in New York City on charges of trespassing, cocaine possession, and resisting arrest. Police in Atlanta had been searching for Joyner for almost 2 weeks in connection with the death of his wife, Ruby, and her friend, Halima Jones. Rick Chambers was one of the Atlanta detectives who had gone to New York to find Joyner. Chambers now headed to the jail where he was being held to pick him up and bring him back to Georgia, where he would face murder charges.
Looked like he'd been rode hard, hung up wet. He looked just totally beat. I actually had to wake him up off of the bench in the holding cell.
That first night of being arrested in New York, I slept so peacefully. It's amazed me how calmly I slept, and it was as if, you know, it's over with now. It's out of my control, and I think I welcomed that. No more running. Running ain't easy. Trust me.
The scene in the holding cell stood in stark contrast to the prosperous life Joyner had once led.
My sister used to call us the Cosbys. You know, 2 professional workers, we had 2 kids. We were that perfect environment.
Authorities now set out to determine how Joyner's seemingly successful past could have taken such a dark turn. Louis Joyner was born in Harlem in 1947. As a young man, he became a programmer during the early stages of business computing, working during the day and teaching at night. In the mid-1960s, Joyner met and married one of his students. The couple had 2 daughters, but divorced after 9 years. In 1974, Joyner became credit systems manager for a chain of New York department stores, Ham & Strauss.
We had a lot of young women and a lot of young people. We had some interesting parties at Abraham & Strauss. And they were interesting. I'll just leave it at that.
While teaching in 1976, Joyner began dating another student, 24-year-old Ruby Livingston. The couple married in 1980.
Ruby is from the South, from the country. Ruby was more of a open, wholesome, if that's the right word, type person, and and a beautiful woman, I might add, and I gravitated to that.
Ruby's niece, Coretta Livingston, remembers visiting her aunt and uncle in New York City.
Louis was my hero. My first impression was him was someone that I could definitely look up to. He was more or less a father figure.
By 1987, Joyner had been hired as a consultant for a fast-growing computer company. He worked hard and quickly developed a reputation as a leader in his field. In 1990, Joyner became a freelance consultant. Seeking a change in lifestyle, he and Ruby moved to Atlanta and purchased this house in the posh suburb of Peachtree City. A year later, tired of the travel his job required, Joyner bought a moving and storage company. With Louis as president and Ruby as office manager, what had been a $700,000 a year business became a $2.4 million corporation in just over 3 years. Joyner was even featured in Black Enterprise magazine. But his newfound wealth and status soon began to take its toll.
I was personally benefiting from the success of the business, but it wasn't doing too well for my marriage. I started going out more. There was a lot of drinking, and we had some some interesting times.
Ruby, meanwhile, developed her own interests and took an active role in a Peachtree City social club for African American women. Among its members was a 36-year-old middle school assistant principal named Halima Jones. Halima's infectious personality appealed to Ruby Joyner, and they became best friends. Halima's outgoing charm also captivated Louis Joyner, but he insists that their relationship was proper, at least initially.
There were many evenings where her boyfriend and I and Ruby and Halima, the four of us would go out to a club, or they'll come over to our house, or we'll go over to their house.
But Louis and Halima shared interests that Ruby did not, including cocaine.
Halima and I were recreational drug users from the onset. I guess that's something else that we had in common. Ruby did it. Ruby was aware of it. Did it very rarely, but she knew about it.
In the spring of 1994, Joyner sold his moving business at a huge profit.
I had money, no job, and all the time in the world. So I just went ape. I went absolutely wild.
Joyner claims his new lifestyle sparked a change in his relationship with Halima Jones.
She came over and we talked, and the gist of the conversation is that there was an interest in us being more than friends. And unfortunately, I reciprocated. So that was the beginning of the next level of our relationship.
Their affair went on for several months before Ruby became suspicious and confronted her husband.
I kind of like laughed it off and said, you gotta be crazy.
Joyner then enlisted Halima to help him cover up the affair.
I suggested to her that she go and speak to Ruby about it, and she did, and Ruby said, no, I don't think you guys are having an affair. And we felt by approaching it head on that the situation was neutralized.
But Ruby wasn't totally convinced and gave Joyner a warning.
Ruby told me, if I find out that you're messing around with Halima, I'm going to cut your testicles off. That's not exactly what she said, but that was close enough.
The threat did not deter Joyner, and he continued his affair with Halima. During the summer of 1995, Joyner says, their relationship intensified, and so did their cocaine use. He claims they took the drug almost every day.
Halima's off from school, okay? She's home all day, I'm home all day. Not the best combination in the world.
This was the situation on November 15th, 1995. That night, Joyner says Halima paged him, wanting cocaine. She and Ruby were shopping and had taken Halima's van. Joyner told the women to meet him in a restaurant parking lot. Once there, he got into the van. It was a volatile situation. Inside the vehicle were Joyner, his wife, his lover, and what everyone would soon discover, a loaded handgun. Joyner says Ruby got out of the van to use the restroom, leaving him and Halima alone.
Halima and I embracing each other and so forth and so on. And the next thing we know, Ruby is at the driver's side, okay? And so now I'm like the kid caught with his hands in the cookie jar. I don't know what the heck she saw.
Joyner claims Ruby did not react, and in fact took over driving so that he and Halima could use cocaine. Joyner says Ruby then drove them to a deserted neighborhood near the airport. There, Joyner says, Ruby stopped the van, got out, and aimed a gun at Halima.
She's standing there with this gun, pointing at Halima, saying, and this is a direct quote, "You cheating bitch." She shoots Halima. I'm sitting there like, unbelievable.
Joyner claims he feared for his life as he bolted from the van and ran into a nearby forest. Behind him, he heard Ruby shooting.
Somewhere in the woods, I trip. Ruby catches up with me. We fight. She had my 2 fingers in her mouth, biting the heck out of me. And me hitting her, my thoughts was to free these hands so I can get away. When I got free, I went back to the van. There's Halima laying there dead. I'm waiting for Ruby to come back. She doesn't. I go back, and there she is. She's dead.
This was the same story Joyner told police after his arrest. Authorities, however, quickly shot it down.
Self-defense does not really come out as a plausible explanation for how Ruby Joyner dies. I have never seen anyone beaten as badly as Ruby Joyner was beaten.
As Joyner's trial approached, even his lawyer, Atlanta defense attorney Steve Sadow, knew it would be a hard story to sell to a jury.
I was very concerned going into the trial because of the nature of the means that the self-defense was employed, that is, beating a woman to death as opposed to a single gunshot or maybe a single knife wound.
On that point, at least, Assistant District Attorney Penny Penn agreed.
It seemed a little unbelievable that he would have had to do what he did to her in order to save himself, which was kill her in a fairly brutal fashion.
What actually happened, according to Penn, was that Joyner had chased down Ruby and beat her to death after he shot and killed Halima. But Penn faced 2 serious challenges. The murder weapon had never been found, and no one could figure out why Joyner would kill his wife or his lover.
I never talked to anybody who could shed any light on what his motive would have been for either women.
On August 19, 1996, in Atlanta, Georgia, the murder trial of Louis Joyner began in a downtown courtroom. The once successful businessman stood accused of killing both his wife Ruby and his mistress, Halima Jones. If convicted, Joyner would face life in prison. Prosecutor Penny Penn believed the evidence against Joyner was compelling, but she saw 2 weaknesses in her case. First, investigators had never found the gun they believed Joyner used to shoot Halima and beat Ruby. Second, no one could establish a motive for the murders.
Juries certainly want to know why someone would commit such a horrible crime. And in this case, I didn't know, and no one seemed to know.
Opening arguments began on August 20th.
The evidence will show that Halima Jones...
Penn laid out for the jury the prosecution's theory about the murders. She maintained that on the night of the crime, Joyner had meant to shoot his wife Ruby, but shot his lover Halima Jones by mistake. He then chased after Ruby to finish the job.
Shots were then fired at Ms. Joyner, and then when the defendant caught up to her, either being out of bullets or because he was actually close to her, he'd made contact with her, he proceeded to beat her to death and strangle her.
If he had not had the affair with Halima...
Joyner's attorney, Steve Sadow, began his opening statement with an unusual and dramatic move. Sadow walked Joyner up to the jury box and presented him to the jurors.
And I want you to see him as a human being.
Sadow admitted that his client's adultery, drug use, and resisting arrest were serious errors in judgment, but he said that didn't make Louis Joyner a killer. Sadow went on to tell the jury that it was Ruby Joyner, not Louis, who had killed Halima. She became enraged, shot Halima, and then turned on Louis.
Which would require him to respond in self-defense.
The state began its case by presenting the physical evidence gathered from the murder scene and Halima Jones' van. Sam House, a Georgia Bureau of Investigation crime scene specialist, testified that Ruby could not have shot Halima in the van, as Joyner claimed.
The absence of blood within the van indicated to me that neither one of the victims had been assaulted or shot within that vehicle.
Did you find any bullet holes in the van, Agent House?
Absolutely none.
Did you find any shell casings in the van? Did you find any live rounds in the van?
None.
On August 22nd, 4 days into the trial, Penn presented photos of the victims, which included graphic and disturbing images of Ruby's badly beaten face.
I think that we needed to concentrate on the evidence that we did have, and we could do that by showing photographs or the actual items.
There's a lot of surfaces like that. This car.
Clayton County Medical Examiner Gerald Gowett testified to the unusually brutal nature of Ruby's beating by what appeared to be the butt of a gun.
Most of these wounds are lacerations. They're blunt force type of trauma. And if you count them up, they come up to 19 and 20 impacts. There are too many injuries here and of such a severity to be consistent with self-defense.
The photos shocked the courtroom. One person fainted. Louis Joyner wept openly. On Monday, August 26th, the prosecution rested. The defense began its case the same day. Steve Sadow knew the evidence against his client was powerful, and he wasted no time in calling his most anticipated witness. That afternoon, Louis Joyner took the stand.
I wanted to testify because I believe, and I still believe to this day, no one could tell the story better than I. No one knew what happened. There's 3 people there. I'm the only one that's left.
Joyner testified that on the night of the killings, Ruby drove him and Halima to a secluded area, stopped the van, and started shouting at Halima.
When Ruby said, "You cheating bitch," I looked in her direction, I saw the gun, and pow.
Joyner testified that Ruby shot Halima and then turned the gun on him.
I saw the gun pointing at me.
And?
I said to myself, this is how I'm going to die.
Joyner said he ran off into the woods, pursued by Ruby. He tripped, and she jumped on him. During their struggle, Joyner said, Ruby bit down on 2 of his fingers. Joyner testified that at some point he got hold of the gun and started to hit Ruby, but insisted that he only wanted to force her to let go of his fingers so that he could escape. Joyner claimed he never intended to kill his wife.
Louis Joyner's testimony on direct examination, that is coming from me, I thought went very well. I felt good about it. I think Louis felt good about it. I know my co-counsel felt good about it. Now, we knew Cross was going to be tough. We thought he'd be able to handle it well.
But the state's cross-examination would prove to be harder than expected. Prosecutor Penn began by pointing out that Joyner's version of events simply didn't fit the forensic evidence.
If you hit someone on the head, you would stun them enough that they would probably open their mouth just long enough where you could get your fingers out.
The prosecution argued that the beating Joyner inflicted on Ruby was vicious overkill. What's more, Penn said, once Joyner got control of the gun, he could have walked away.
He was able to get the gun from her, and that could have been the end of it.
Penn kept the pressure on. She now called on Joyner to prove his story by reenacting the struggle using a life-sized cloth dummy. Defense attorney Steve Sadow knew the demonstration could be humiliating for his client, but decided not to object.
Was I thrilled with the tactic used? No. Was there anything legally I could do to stop it? No. Would it have hurt me, in my opinion, to have made a big deal out of it in front of the jury? Yes.
It's not a fair depiction. That dummy is not hitting me. that dummy is not posing a threat to me.
You did have control of the gun, didn't you?
No.
Jurors watched as Joyner rolled on the courtroom floor with the dummy, attempting to simulate the fight. Prosecutor Penn had hoped that the demonstration would make Joyner look ridiculous and unsympathetic. Even the defense had to admit that she'd succeeded.
It was the shining moment for the prosecutor. It was not the best moment for the defense.
So as soon as he does...
Penn then attacked Joyner's story by barraging him with questions about what she believed had happened the night of the murders.
Just not believable. And what happened exactly, Mr. Joyner? You were shooting at Ruby and you missed and you shot Halima instead?
No, ma'am.
And that's just making you a little madder? First that you've shot the wrong woman and then that you can't shoot the one you intended to kill?
No, ma'am.
And by the time you get up to the woods, you don't have any more bullets, do you, Mr. Joyner? And you catch up to Ruby, and that's when you begin just beating the living hell out of her? Isn't that what was going on?
No, ma'am.
On August 27, 1996, after 6 days of testimony, both sides made their closing arguments.
Whatever he did to his wife, those acts committed were not in self-defense. His wife had been beaten about the head at least 20 times and also strangled.
Penn then told the jury that even though the murder weapon had never been found, the evidence showed that Joyner was also responsible for the death of Halima Jones.
I submit to you that from the very beginning, Louis Joyner had the gun. That Ruby Joyner never touched that gun, never got control of that gun. Only one person had it, it was the defendant. Therefore, Ruby Joyner could not have killed Halima Jones.
If someone is sitting on top of you or has got a gun pointed in your face, that it doesn't get any more reasonable to then react in self-defense and use the same force in response. If it's speculation, call it speculation. If it's conjecture, call it what it is. If it's guesswork, call it what it is. But don't let that substitute for proof. And don't let your feelings override the evidence and the lack thereof.
On August 28, 1996, in Atlanta, Georgia, the jury in the murder trial of Louis Joyner returned with a verdict. It had taken only 4 hours for them to decide whether Joyner was guilty of killing his wife Ruby and his mistress Halima Jones. Louis Joyner sat motionless as the first verdict was read.
We, the jury, find the defendant Louis Albert Joyner, Jr., count 1, murder, guilty.
Joyner was found guilty of murder in the beating death of his wife, Ruby. Ruby's niece, Coretta Livingston, who had once looked up to Louis Joyner, believed the jury had made the right decision.
I just started praying and praising God, even though I was not totally happy because I still didn't know what had happened. I just felt good knowing that some justice would be served because my aunt had gotten murdered. Somebody has to be responsible.
But there was still one more verdict to be handed down.
Count 4, murder, not guilty.
And a surprise to many in the courtroom, Louis Joyner was cleared of all charges in the murder of Halima Jones. WSB radio reporter Richard Sangster covered the trial.
I think Halima Jones' family did not get the justice they deserved. They were absolutely shocked by the fact that Louis Joyner was able to skirt away from the murder of Halima Jones and pinned it on his wife.
The split verdict also held a disturbing implication for Ruby's family. Louis Joyner, they believed, had tarnished her memory by insisting that she had shot and killed Halima. To Ruby's family, the jury's decision now implied that they believed Joyner's story.
They were quite shaken by that even the thought that Ruby Joyner was capable of murdering someone.
Not in a million years would I even believe that my aunt would even have had a gun.
Juror Amari Rosado told American Justice that the evidence regarding the death of Ruby Joyner had been clear. The number of blows inflicted on her meant that Louis Joyner could not have acted in self-defense.
You know, the 18 times, there was no way that this would have been self-defense, in my opinion.
As for the death of Halima Jones, Rosado explained that he and the other jurors returned a verdict of not guilty simply because there wasn't enough evidence to convict. But Rosado says that didn't mean they bought Joyner's account that Ruby had killed her.
I believe that there was beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Joyner committed the murder against his wife, Ruby. I wasn't convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed the murder against Halima. So, not to say that we didn't believe that he might have done it, gut feeling that he might have killed them both.
Georgia law dictates a mandatory life sentence for murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge now handed down his ruling.
I sentence you to life in prison.
What really happened the night of November 15th, 1995, and why? Among the living, only Louis Joyner was there. But after months of investigation and years of reflection, Detective Rick Chambers has his own theory. He believes Joyner simply wanted to get his wife out of the way so that he could continue his relationship with Halima.
Louis Joyner shot Halima Jones in an attempt to shoot Ruby Joyner, missed her, hit Halima Jones. The gun jammed on him, and his only recourse at that point was to beat Ruby Joyner to death with the gun and strangle her.
Coretta Livingston doesn't have a theory about how her aunt was killed. She says she is still waiting for answers from the only person who knows the truth, Louis Joyner.
I'm being honest and from my heart. I'm telling you what I feel. I can't even say that I hate him, but I'd still have to know why.
To Coretta and others, Louis Joyner's transformation from celebrated businessman to convicted murderer remains a mystery. But Joyner is adamant that he is not a killer.
If you look at the situation, there has never, ever been a motive established of why I would want to shoot Halima and kill Ruby. None. And the reason is, none exists.
One could say that the way his life had ended up was a tragedy, but that was one that he brought on himself. You know, at the end of the day, he's still alive.
The sad thing is, two beautiful people are dead. The sad thing is their family, which I loved and enjoyed a relationship with them for over 15 years, are now without someone that they love and I love, and I brought that on, and I have to live with that.